Hey, Alan Rowland again. Now, I'm going to give a presentation today. It's going to be a little bit longer than the ones that you've been normally seeing from me, and a little bit different than that, too. Recently, we've been focusing on Walker County, Alabama, Jasper, Alabama, some of the early founders and some of the early leaders during that period of time, and I'm talking about in the 1800s, even 1700s. But on a previous presentation, I mentioned my great-great-grandfather, William Thomas Pattillo. And I told you at that time that he fought for the Confederate States of America. In fact, he was first lieutenant with the 54th Alabama and Company G, as a matter of fact. So anyway, that's the presentation today, and I'm proud of my great-great-grandfather. I never met him. He died 31 years before I was born. He died in 1918. But anyway, let's get into our talk today. And I think it always helps if we have our narrative in front of us. You know, as a teacher, I learned that as a teacher, that when I lecture to somebody and I talk to them, they retain very, very little of that. And if I put it in writing and then talk to them, then they learn much, much more. So that's the idea behind my style of presentation. Again, the individual I'm talking about is the Reverend, he was a Methodist minister, William Thomas Pattillo, first lieutenant, Company G, 54th Alabama, and the Confederate States of America. And he was born in the year 1840, 16th November, and I learned how to pronounce his name right outside of Auburn. And the name is Lochapoka, Alabama. It was at that time in the Civil War, it was known as, it was in Macon County, and today it's in Lee County. That has since been changed, and he died on 31st of July in 1918 at Montevallo. Age 77, he's buried in Montevallo Cemetery. I'll show you a photograph of his burial site, resting place later. Married to, they called her Sally. She was Sarah Virginia Cole. She was born at LaPlace, near Tuskegee, born in 1867, and she died in Macon County, Alabama in 1845 at the age of 85. I should have restated that anyway. They were married in LaPlace, and then she was born in Macon County and then died, and I think it was Montevallo, that's where she married in Montevallo Cemetery. And if you would like to see what this lovely couple looked like, here is a likeness of them, an old photograph, and it's showing you William Thomas Pattillo, of course, here, and his wife, Sarah. They called her Sally there. Aren't they a cute couple? Notice there that he is holding a Bible in his hand. So anyway, I kept that photograph on my desk at the college for many, many years until I retired a couple of years ago, and now it sits on my desk at home. All right, so let's move on and give you some more background on William Thomas Pattillo. And here's his father, Nathan Winfield Pattillo. He also fought for the Confederacy, but he was very old at that time, very elderly, and so he mainly just served in the home guard, so to speak, there in Macon County. Notice the years of his date of his life. 1817, he was born on 30th of May, Greene County, Alabama, and he is buried in Pine Knot Cemetery. That's in Beehive, Alabama, just a couple of miles from where Auburn University is today. He died in 1878. I'll show you a photograph of his burial site, his resting place at Pine Knot Cemetery, as the presentation comes to a close. He was married twice. His first wife was Eliza Ann Rogers Hightower. You'll see that name again shortly. And she was born in 1821 in Putnam, Georgia, and died in 1860. And she's likewise buried in Pine Knot Cemetery. After she passed away, Nathan Winfield Pattillo married again, and his second wife is buried right beside him. You'll see his burial site there, and one wife on one side and one side wife on the other. It's kind of interesting here, and if you look through my family history, and I'm retired military. My dad was retired military, and it's just all through our family history, and we trace this back to the 1600s. You'll find so many of my ancestors, my dad's ancestors, my mother's ancestors, that did serve in the defense of this country. And both of those individuals, Elizabeth Hightower, Eliza Hightower, and Nathan Pattillo, both had fathers who fought in the War of 1812. Both had grandfathers who fought in the Revolutionary War. And by the way, Nathan Winfield Pattillo and Eliza Ann Rogers Hightower, those individuals are my great-great-great-grandparents. I'll show you photographs of their burial places after a while. Okay, continuing on with the presentation here, prior to the Civil War, and I don't know a lot about my great-great-grandfather, William Thomas Pattillo, before the Civil War, and I imagine it was just a rather routine Southern upbringing. Education was always stressed as a quality here. And he was a student at East Alabama Male Seminary. That's where Auburn University is today. This is the original name of Auburn University, East Alabama Male Seminary. More on that towards the close of the lecture, and I'll explain the evolution, the history of Auburn. In 1861, on the 1st of September, William Thomas Pattillo enlisted as a private soldier, and I'm talking about private, and enlisted in the Macon Rifles. Now, some people refer to this as Captain Rush's company, primarily because the member that organized this was Captain John W. Rush. All right, and for William Thomas Pattillo, he enlisted with his college roommate, William H. Barksdale, and also his mother's youngest brother, E.F. Hightower. And I don't know his name other than just E.F., and maybe that's just what they call him. I don't know here. Now, so they enlisted there, remained in that area for a period of time, just a couple of weeks. And then the company, Captain Rush's company, Macon Rifles, they were ordered to Memphis. They traveled by train from Atlanta to Chattanooga to Memphis. And once they arrived in Memphis, they were deployed about 3 miles to the northeast of Memphis on what is called Wolf Creek. And that's where they served as a training ground for several months there. Now, if you're curious about that, where Wolf Creek is located, this is near Collierville, Tennessee, or Germantown, Tennessee, just right northeast of Memphis itself. And he was promoted to second sergeant. So we don't have that rank in the Army today. We have first sergeant, but we do not have the rank of second sergeant. During the Civil War, they had second sergeant, third sergeant, etc. there. All right, now, in that period, for William Thomas Pattillo and also the soldiers that were with his unit, and this is not just in his company, this is in the other companies that were in the area, a measles epidemic just ravaged through the ranks here, and many of them died. And we don't think about that today as people dying of measles, and I don't anyway. Most of us have been vaccinated for measles long ago. At least I was. In December 1861, the company was ordered to Fort Pillow, Tennessee, but W.T. Pattillo was so sick, recovering from the measles, that he was left behind. He was left in the hands for 4 weeks in private care. And in fact, they had to pay the caregiver $10. I don't know who took care of him, but the family had paid $10. His father, Nathan, had given him $25 when he had left for war, and so he had to take 10 of those dollars and use it for recovery. But eventually he rejoined his unit at Fort Pillow. Some of you may have heard of this place before. Fort Pillow is located on the Mississippi River. It's north of Memphis. It's near a place which is called kind of near Tiptonville. And it had a terrible story, and I don't know if any of this is true or not, but later in the war in 1864, supposedly the Northern forces had taken Fort Pillow, and Nathan Bedford Forrest the Confederacy did attack Fort Pillow and took it over. And the Northern soldiers defending the fort were primarily African-American soldiers, and they surrendered to Nathan Bedford Forrest soldiers. And some people say, and I don't know, we get a lot of conflicting reports on this, is that the Confederate soldiers then turned upon the African-American Northern soldiers and just slaughtered them. Other accounts say that was simply not the case right there. It didn't happen. Other accounts say that after the African-American soldiers surrendered, then they struck up a rebellion again, and then the Confederate soldiers picked up their weapons, and just and killed them. So I really don't know what the true story is. That it all depends upon the author and the author's viewpoints there. So let's go back to our camera here. And anyway, finally arriving at Fort Pillow, the company was joined by other companies here, and this is a long story, I'm trying to condense it, but it formed the 1st Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi Regiment. That's what it was known as. That's one word, the 1st Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi Regiment, and they were under the command of Alpheus Baker. He's from Eufaula, Alabama. If you search around, you can find some photographs on him. I did not get a photograph for this presentation. By early 1862, the regiment was ordered to New Madrid, Missouri, and that's just a little bit north of where Fort Pillow, Tennessee is located today anyway. And by mid-March, this regiment relocated across the Mississippi River to the New Madrid Bend near Island Number 10. Island Number 10 is not in existence today. Island Number 10 is underwater in the Mississippi River. All right, now I'll show you a map of this in just a little bit to give you a better perspective on it. But by early April 1862, Island Number 10 fell to Northern troops, and the 1st Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi Regiment was surrendered. And it always makes you wonder, why were they surrendered? And best I can tell, they didn't even discharge their weapons, maybe a couple of times or something, not very much. But I was drawing a sketch, this little map showing you the way it was. Here's where New Madrid is located here. New Madrid is across the river over in Missouri itself. Now, when you cross the river, you're over in Tennessee. Now, where Island Number 10 is right here. And notice how the Mississippi here makes a gigantic bend. It's just a huge horseshoe bend that goes around New Madrid. All right, so where the Confederate troops were, they were not where my grandfather, great-great-grandfather was, but the Confederates were defending Island Number 10, and it fell into the hands of Northern troops. Now, where William Thomas Pattillo and the 1st Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi Regiment were right here. That is not in a good position. I mean, it doesn't take much of an Army strategist to figure this out. So if your soldiers are in this position here, and the North comes in at Island Number 10, and also from this area, they just cut you off. And that's what happened here, is that these, my great-great-grandfather's troops here, the unit he was in, they were just all trapped, and they subsequently just surrendered. And like I said, surrendered with hardly a shot being fired. Some of the individuals actually made their escape here. My great-great-grandfather was not one of those, and went south here over to where Reelfoot Lake is, and actually just got in a little skiff or logs, floating logs, and actually were able to float across Reelfoot Lake and make their escape, but not for my great-great-grandfather. All right, so he was taken as a prisoner here, and Sergeant Pattillo and Second Sergeant Pattillo and other enlisted soldiers were transported by train to a prisoner of war facility at Camp Douglas, Chicago. Now, what they ended up doing, the North that had captured the 1st Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi, they segregated the soldiers based upon their rank. They sent the officers up to Johnson's Island, which is at Lake Erie. Then I guess probably some of the NCOs and non-commissioned officers went to Camp Douglas, and then many of the soldiers actually went to Camp Chase. Well, where my great-great-grandfather, William Thomas Pattillo, he went to Camp Douglas in Chicago here. During that period of time, as he recorded it, 1/3 of the prisoners died in captivity, including his college roommate, William Barksdale. All right, by early September, these prisoners were exchanged at Vicksburg. Now, if you don't understand what I'm talking about this with an exchange, for the Confederacy was capturing Northern soldiers. For the Northern soldiers, they were capturing Southern soldiers, rebel soldiers, you want to call them that anyway. And so we don't do this today, but at that time, let's say that you had 5,000 Northern soldiers and 5,000 Confederate soldiers, and they would just be literally exchanged, and they would go back to the other side right there. They put a stop to that about halfway through the war, because it's really, really unnecessary, because soldiers just go back, for fighting again. All right, so anyway, so he was exchanged there, and this was at Vicksburg. And he actually had enlisted for 1 year period of service, and all these guys had only enlisted for 1 year's period of service under the Confederate Conscription Act. But Confederacy realized very quickly that the war was not going to be over in a year, so they extended the enlistment here, and it was a mandatory conscription here that would extend to the for 4 years, I believe it was anyway. And this included all males, from the ages of 17 to 50. So my great-great-grandfather was caught up in this. Although he had enlisted and his term of enlistment was over, now he was forced to extend this. I don't think he fought that by any means here. And eventually it was extended for the duration of the war, or perhaps you could say for life, because you'll probably be killed here. All right, so he was not released from service. Okay, so the 1st Alabama Tennessee and Mississippi Regiment reorganized. At this point, they became known as the 54th Alabama Confederate States of America. And for William Thomas Pattillo, he was elected. And that's what you did at that time, your junior officers in particular, up until probably Lieutenant Colonel anyway, were just elected. And he was elected as 1st Lieutenant of Company Chief. And E.F. Hightower, who was his mother's youngest son, was the 2nd lieutenant, youngest brother, was elected as 2nd lieutenant. The company commander was Captain John H. Christian. I'll show you a photograph of his burial place later. I think there was a lot of respect for him, for Captain Christian. All right, by early 1863, 1st Lieutenant Pattillo began to experience chills. He came down with cholera. Cholera will take your life, my friends, and he almost died. I put he also died. It's almost died. As a result, he was sent, or supposed to be sent, to a hospital in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, if you're not familiar with this area, Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Jackson, Mississippi are probably 30 minutes apart from each other, 30 miles on that order. Of course, traveling by train at that time, it would have taken much longer anyway. And he was, when he was supposedly taken to the hospital in Jackson, this allowed him to miss the battle that took place at Baker's Creek. Some people call this Big Black Creek, and it is. It's a very, very dark Blackwater-sized river. It's not too far from where another battle took place there called Champion's Hill. Some of you may be familiar with that too. But both of those affairs were rather bloody, and for William Thomas Pattillo, fortunately, he was able to dodge that bullet. I mean, literally anyway. The Northern troops, on the other hand, had cut the railroad track from Vicksburg to Jackson, so W.T. Pattillo could not go to Jackson, so he was returned to Vicksburg and placed in an infirmary there. Maybe it was a hospital that was present in Vicksburg. Shortly after this, Vicksburg fell to the U.S. Grant's Northern forces, and once again, William Thomas Pattillo was taken as a prisoner of war. All right, so that's his second time as a prisoner. Here we go. And strangely enough, the Northern soldiers kept these prisoners a very short period of time, and then they didn't release them, but they paroled them to a camp in Demopolis, Alabama. And that's where 1st Lieutenant Pattillo was present there. He and a number of individuals, and stayed there for a couple of months there. But in early 1864, Lieutenant Pattillo and his fellow soldiers were once again exchanged, and he was involved in several skirmishes after that in the northern Mississippi area. He served under the command of General Stephen D. Lee. And General Stephen D. Lee, who was from Mississippi, buried in Mississippi to my knowledge anyway, was given responsibility to try to eliminate some of the northern presence there in northern Mississippi here, particularly on General Smith there. All right, so anyway, he was involved in that, but then shortly after that, the unit was relocated, and they were sent to Pollard, Alabama. That's in the southeastern part of the state of Alabama. And it doesn't make much sense to me, according to the records, he was sent to Pollard, Alabama. But then they were given assignment for picket duty in Mobile Bay. Well, Mobile Bay is on the other side of the state of Alabama. It's over on the southwestern side of Alabama. But by 1865, in January, the brigade was deployed from the Mobile area to North Carolina, and through that area anyway. And they actually, wait a minute, I missed something right here. Did I get that? Here. All right. Anyway, and where did I? There we go. I'm sorry about that here. I missed something down at the bottom there. The 54th Alabama was then deployed. This is after they left Demopolis, and they were deployed to the Atlanta area to defend the city from Sherman's Yankees. And 54th Alabama participated in the Battle of Atlanta. It took place on that date, 22nd July, 1864, a bloody affair. Even worse than that was the Battle of Ezra Church on the 28th of July in 1864. And that's where 2nd Lieutenant E.F. Hightower was killed. All right, now we're back on track here. And it was after that point here where they were sent down to Pollard and served on picket duty in Mobile Bay. And from there, the brigade was deployed from the Mobile area and went to North Carolina. And at North Carolina, that's where they fought at the Battle of Bentonville, and a small battlefield, but you can go there if you wish to do so. They were fighting under General Joseph E. Johnston. This was right at the end of the Civil War. This was January 1865. The Battle of Bentonville took place, if I remember correctly, in March 1865. And it was during that battle that William Thomas Pattillo was struck on the forearm by a canister shot, a piece of shrapnel, and it never broke the skin. So he was very fortunate. That was the only injury, and that was just a superficial injury, of the war. All right. And let's see here. Following the battle at Bentonville, the remains of the army under Joseph Johnson retreated to Greensboro, North Carolina, and subsequently Johnson surrendered. And he surrendered to General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, and W.T. Pattillo was paroled. That's for the third time, and the Southern soldiers wearily walked home, and he had to do that. So we're talking about, from North Carolina and walking back to Alabama. So after the war, William Thomas Pattillo, he returned to East Alabama Male Seminary. The college had closed from 1861 to 1865, and he graduated in 1868 as an ordained Methodist minister. My mother always told me, when she would talk about W.T. Pattillo, and she never met him. He died before she was born. My mother was born in 1924, and he died in 1918. But she would always talk about him and say that he graduated in the 4th graduating class at Auburn University, which of course was East Alabama Male Seminary at that time. All right. And anyway, so he graduated. He was ordained as a Methodist minister. And in the year following that, he taught classical languages at the college. I found that to be kind of interesting because I worked at a college for many, many years. My daughter works at the college. My father worked at a college. And even my great-great-grandfather worked at a college. So maybe I'm bragging a little bit, and I apologize for that. I think that's kind of interesting. In 1870, William Thomas Pattillo, Reverend Pattillo, joined the North Alabama Conference. This is the Methodist Conference, by the way. And so he's a Methodist minister. He served as a there we go. Got too much material here. All right, and he served in the Methodist, as the First Methodist Church in Hartselle, Alabama. Years later, and this is kind of interesting, years later he became the first superannuate Methodist minister in the state of Alabama, and he would live in Montevallo. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, superannuate, but you think about this, for most ministers, back in those times, if you got too old, to support yourself, well, that was just it. You just didn't support yourself. And so what the Methodist Church did, they began a program that would provide like living expenses and a pension and a place to stay for these Methodist ministers. And minimum requirement, you had to be a minister for 15 years. But my great-great-grandfather, William Thomas Pattillo, was the first superannuate minister in the state of Alabama. I'll show you a photograph of his house in just a minute. All right, in Montevallo. Okay, so these are his children. And Annie Elizabeth Pattillo, I'm not going to give you the dates on that. Marvin Pattillo, I can remember my mother talking about Marvin. I never met him. Mary Cole Pattillo, 1872 to 1962. She was my great-grandmother. I remember her very, very well. Tall lady. I called her Mamie. And I always liked her. She was a very, very pleasant individual. Pierce Pattillo died in 1941. And I can remember from my childhood my mother telling me that he committed suicide. And maybe that's not accurate, but I think that is true anyway. I can remember my mother talking about Helen Pattillo, Sally Will Pattillo, who was a sister to my great-grandmother, Mamie Pattillo. Sally Will Pattillo, I remember her very, very well. She was elderly. I was a little boy at the time, but I remember she was very elderly. Always surrounded by cats. It seemed like she had about 12 cats, and all she would do is just sit in her rocker with a shawl over and have those cats sitting in her lap all around her. And lastly, there was Wesley Allen Pattillo. Notice Allen, my name, and of course I was named for the Allen as my middle name anyway. And we also had on my mother's side, there was a family, Allen. So anyway, that's my name comes from that period. All right, and as I promised you earlier, here's a breakdown of East Alabama Male Seminary, the evolution of it anyway. 1859 and 1872 is when it closed, and it closed in 1861 to 1865, but it did close in 1872, or maybe I should restate that. It became known as a different title here as the Alabama Polytechnic Institute from 1872 until 1960, and from 1960 on, it was known as Auburn University. All right, I want to share some other photographs with you, and this is a photograph of myself much earlier in my life anyway. And notice the saber I'm holding right there. This is a saber sword. It's a infantry officer's sword, and that was the sword, the saber of William Thomas Pattillo. I knew the person. She was an aunt of mine, and she had that in her possession, and I tried to get her to give that to me, and she would not. And for the life of me, I don't know where. She's not living now, I'm sure, but I don't know where that saber is today. So let me run through some photographs here of William Thomas Pattillo, and this is Montevallo Cemetery, and you can see William Thomas Pattillo here, the Reverend William Thomas Pattillo, and also his wife here over on that side. Here's another photograph of the same cemetery showing you William Thomas Pattillo in the middle, great-great-grandmother here, Sarah here, and Aunt Sally Will, the lady I was telling you about with all the cats, in the rocker with a shawl on her anyway. That's where she is buried. And here's just another photograph showing you the cemetery. And the first superannuate house, and this is located in Montevallo. I got a chance to go in that house, and I just very bravely one day went up and knocked on the door and told the owner who I was, and the owner said, well, come on in and have a tour of the house. And so she took me all through the house. That was an interesting experience with that, you know. And this photograph here is taken off of the Bentonville battlefield. That's where William Thomas Pattillo had the canister round to hit him on the forearm here. All right. And this is a photograph I mentioned to you about Captain Christian, John H. Christian. That's a photograph of his grave. I don't even remember where I ran across that photograph, that tombstone. I'm not real sure about this. This is located in Greenwood, Mississippi, a place called Fort Pemberton. Now, I have nothing in my great-grandfather's records that indicate that he was at Fort Pemberton, but the history of the unit places the regiment at Fort Pemberton, so I don't know if he was there or not, but anyway, that's just showing you a historical marker where he may have served. Here's Pine Knot Cemetery. Some people call it the Dawson Family Cemetery, located right outside of Auburn, about 5 miles. Not even that far, maybe 3 miles. My great-great-grandfather, Nathan Winfield Pattillo. Here's a photograph of it in Pine Knot Cemetery. Nathan Winfield Pattillo here, and his 2 wives. No, I think that's Nathan Winfield Pattillo here, and his 2 wives over here. I told you wrong a while ago. The way I remembered it, they were on each side of him, but I guess they're not. Anyway, here's some other things, interesting things about William Thomas Pattillo. Here are his service records here, showing you 54th Alabama Company G, First Lieutenant. Let's see if I can find some of the others here. Too big to show all of this, but here's some of the service records itself. Just a muster report is what it actually is. Showing you him in Hollywood, Alabama. That's up near Scottsboro, between Scottsboro and Stevenson. So apparently when they did this report, he was en route to the Atlanta area. I'm guessing anyway. Some other things here. This is an actual letter from William Thomas Pattillo. This is a photocopy. I didn't bring out the original for this. But this is a letter in my great-grandfather's handwriting, and which is just describing his experience in the Civil War. Here's another letter from William Thomas Pattillo, and This was taken, I made a photocopy out of this. This was in the Alabama State Archives in Montgomery. And he wrote a letter to Tom Owens, Mr. Tom Owens, and director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And once again, he's just describing his experience in the war. But I thought this was rather unique, that one of my great-grandfather's letters was actually in the state archives. All right. Here is an account, and this was not typed. It was handwritten and then later typed. It's just the diary, kind of an autobiography of William Thomas Pattillo's time during the Civil War. And much of what the presentation I gave you came from this actual diary account here. All right, and that was written, by the way, in 1901. I ran across this also. This is from my great-great-grandmother. I can't read it very well in the light here. Anyway, let's see if I can get the light to do a little bit better. Sarah Virginia Pattillo, they called her Sally, and she was making an application for a Confederate pension. And that's what many of these women would do. Their husbands had died, and then after they died, the wives would apply to the state and try to get a government pension. And it's rather lengthy here, kind of interesting to look at, in her handwriting. And I guess she got that. Some of the other things I used for this, and putting this presentation together, just a history of the 54th Alabama. Another presentation here. Here we go. Confederate military history, gives the history there of the 54th Alabama. And that's all interesting. Okay, so anyway, that's the presentation. I appreciate your attention. That was a rather lengthy presentation, but I'm very proud of my great-great-grandfather, William Thomas Pattillo. It gives me an urge to go back to Montevallo and revisit the grave. Done so many times, but I'd like to do that again. Montevallo is a good place, good school too, by the way. All right, thank you very much.